Welcome to the Internet of Things Made Simple. I'm Larry Bohumer. This is episode number 11, and I thank you for joining us. A special shout out to our new listeners. There's been a bunch of you in January. Welcome aboard. And as always, two reminders. Check out our webpage, theinternetofThingsMadeSimple.com, which has some phenomenal material on IoT. And I always ask, subscribe to this podcast using your favorite podcast service. In our main topic, we're going to cover how IoT is changing all different aspects of the world of energy. But to open, we're going to talk about how AI is solving an issue for parents, and that's how we can help you to find the perfect babysitter. As a parent, I know there's always some concern when you leave your child with a babysitter. In the past, parents had to rely on things like word of mouth or potentially references to find that perfect babysitter. AI solutions are striving to help parents find the ideal babysitter by analyzing their online behavior, but this has a number of potential issues. The software looks at some of the posts they might have done and gives the parents a score from 1 to 5 based on the suspected level of drug abuse and things like if they've shown any online bullying behavior. This technology is not new. It's the same technology that's been used by employers to screen potential employees. However, there are a number of issues they have to work through. One, teenagers are known to be sarcastic. I know I have one in the house. And this would be their main audience they're going after here. Does this software account for that? I'm not quite sure. And also, does the software differentiate if the post was written by the user, or if they're just doing something like quoting a song lyric or a line from a movie? There's also a disconnect between what people post online and their real life. And there was a funny story to this. There was a survey that was done to analyze what most wives post about their husbands on Facebook and how that relates to what they search on Google. On Facebook, it was all about things like, he is the most loving person, he is the love of my life, he is the greatest thing since sliced bread, I am so glad that I married him. However, when people aren't listening on Google, it was more likely things like, how do I get my husband to stop being a lazy ass? How do I get him to lose weight? And how do I get him to listen more? So as you can see, there's often a difference between what people post online and in real life. Time will tell if this will catch on. Either way, it is a good lesson for teenagers, and I have told this to my son, that things you post online now can definitely come back to bite you, so be careful on what you post. It tends to have a lot longer life than you think. When we come back from a short break, we're going to look at how IoT is shaping the world of energy. Back in 5 seconds. Okay, welcome back. The energy industry is such a large one that we really could do a complete show about any of these 4 areas. And depending on how well this episode is received, we very well might. But for now, we're going to talk about 4 key areas on a higher level of the energy complex and how IoT is helping to improve their productivity. Those 4 areas are the extracting of fossil fuels from the ground, and you could also link this to mining as well. The second one is how these fossil fuels are delivered, whether that's going to a refinery or to an energy producer or to an end customer. The third one is how it's helping the green energy space, and that includes things like wind turbines and solar panels and many other ones. And the final area is how it's helping to improve the delivery of electricity. And that's how it goes both to your area as well as to your home and business. When one thinks about the fossil fuel space, the natural inclination is to think about transportation. And that's for obvious reasons. Planes, trains, and automobiles, which, if I may say, is one of my favorite movies of all time. You know, it's John Candy and Steve Martin at their best. So if you haven't seen it, you have my permission to stop and pause this podcast, go watch that great movie, and then come back and pick up again. So those 3 areas use millions of barrels of oil on a daily basis, so it's pretty obvious it's big business. However, it's important to note that there are many other ways that fossil fuels are used, and that ranges from the production of plastic, which I know is controversial for some people, to the production of batteries, many of which are used in the electric cars like Teslas, and to create many medicines. So even though we might want to reduce the use of fossil fuels for transportation, it's important to point out they are used for many other things as well. And as much as we would love to do the transition away from fossil fuels, the reality is that we're not going anywhere soon away from them. In fact, it's probably going to be 30 to 50 years. So it makes a lot of sense to minimize the impact of these fossil fuels. And that's where IoT, along with AI and big data, they're helping to make the extraction of them safer, more productive, and to do so while causing less harm and emissions for the environment. So it's a win-win for everybody. The first thing they're doing is to make sure they reduce the amount of dry wells that are drilled. And that's when you drill the well and find out, yeah, there was nothing there. Bit of a waste of time. Before the drilling ever takes place, IoT is powering much of the geology and surveys that are done. And this helps engineers to first better locate where large deposits are, but more importantly, to have a better understanding of any possible obstacles in the way. Once a decision has been made to drill, data from IoT helps to optimize the process. And that's everything from the machinery to the pace of the drilling to any environmental issues that might be going on at the same time. And this helps to reduce the length of a drill as well as the cost. It's important to keep people safe, and that's where sensors are used very heavily on the rig itself. And this is to alert for the presence of overheated parts. It could also be for unwanted gases that are in the area, and it allows workers to be alarmed and to take precautions. One of the issues that many people don't know about in the area of drilling has to do with radio interference. Many of the blasts, and yes, they actually put down explosives down the hole and blast rock and blast things out of the way, are controlled by different forms of radio. So interference, although it's much less than it would have been in the past, is a possibility. And I think people can understand that's the last thing you want to do is to explode some kind of an explosive before you're ready. As well, it makes sense to a lot of people that the last thing you want to have anywhere close to an active oil well is a spark of any kind. And that's why certain grades of equipment are used. You may have heard the term Class 1 Div 2 or Class 1 Div 1. These have to do with what kind of spark or what kind of heat or anything else can be created and how close or in proximity they can be to the source. So this is primarily, as I mentioned, for the oil well, but this is also for things like pipelines, and it's also the reason why you have warning signs not to use your phone anywhere close to the gas pump. Although I'm not sure it causes as much issue, it's better safe than sorry. You might wonder, how does IoT help? Because isn't IoT about transmitting? So how would IoT help to reduce the potential usage of a device close to an oil well? It does so using GPS. So if you can imagine you're driving up to a site, they're going to have certain proximity barriers based on different distances. So say, 100 yards from the site, all vehicles must be parked there. And then within a certain area close to the well site, certain devices can't be used. And that's what happens is when these devices get within those ranges of a known site, they'll go into what's easily described, I guess, as airplane mode. It's not really, but most people understand what airplane mode is. And then once the vehicle leaves that proximity, the GPS can realize that and reactivate the cellular signal. And the same goes for all handhelds and devices. Once the well has been complete, IoT or SCADA, which I'll talk about in a second, kick in. And you can imagine why it's important to monitor these things. They're not really drilling, I've never seen one anyways, a well in downtown Houston. All the wells that happen in Texas, as an example, tend to happen many miles away from a downtown core or even from where people live for the most part, although that's changing sometimes. But these wells produce thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a day in production, and many people are relying on them, whether it's a gas station or utility company. So keeping these wells up and running is vital. But how do you do that when you don't have workers who are sitting by them all the time? And that's where SCADA solutions, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, long before the term IoT ever became popular, many people in the industrial space, so whether that's oil and gas or factories, use the term SCADA, which stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It really is the same idea as what IoT does, although they do use some specific ports, they have some very unique languages or protocols. It's kind of its own thing, but for all intents and purposes, you can look at it as IoT. Well, these SCADA solutions help to maintain things like production levels to make sure that the well is producing. It's checking for heat and other things with the equipment. And it's also checking for unwanted things, like is there an excessive amount of water mixing into the overall mixture? The last thing they're doing with a lot of these solutions at the remote site is keeping them safe. Because you can imagine if you want to attack a company or a region or even an industry, one way to do that is to cut off the flow of their key product. So security solutions are being used quite heavily in the oil patch and other areas. Once the product is out of the ground, it has to be delivered to customers. And the customers vary here. It could be going to an electricity producer who's using it to create electricity with the turbines. It could be going to a refiner. It could be going to someone that's using the raw material for other things. Whatever they're using it for, it's important that the mixture coming out of the ground is delivered safely. And that can be done a few ways. I know there's a lot of controversy about pipelines, and I'm not going to get into that here. But for the purposes of this section, it really doesn't matter how it's shipped. It can be via pipeline, a train, a truck, a boat, whatever method you use. IoT solutions are helping to improve the logistics as well as to keep everyone along the way safe. Sensors are used to monitor first how much the product is loaded. And that makes kind of sense. You need to know how much you pulled out of the ground and then how much of it has then made it into your delivery mechanism. That way you can know if you've had stuff stolen or there's possible leak, things like that. And it's also to make sure that product doesn't escape. Everyone thinks of oil, but they don't think of the gases side, which can find its way out of the smallest little cracks if it's not sealed properly. So this monitoring includes monitoring the actual container or pipeline, as well as for the environmental conditions. If some kind of change has to be made based on the ambient temperature, as an example, sensors will allow the engineers to see that there's been an unexpected change in the ambient temperature and make whatever changes they may have to make. Once the product leaves the site, it then has to be delivered. And that's where GPS solutions, especially in the area of vehicles, are coming into play. Just like any other GPS-enabled solution, it's keeping track of where the vehicle is, where it is compared to where it should be, how is it being operated, but also it monitors for any potential escape of liquids or gases, and it monitors, as I mentioned, the container itself. Once the product arrives, sensors kick in to let you know how much has been offloaded, and that's for a couple of reasons. You kind of have to know how much you're dropping off at a gas station or a refinery to be able to bill them. But more importantly, you want to make sure that all the fuel that was supposed to arrive did arrive, whether that's potentially for theft or, as I mentioned, any kind of leakage. Once it's at the refinery, IoT doesn't stop. As you can imagine, keeping a refinery up and running is very important for a few reasons. Obviously, economically, but many people rely on the fuel that comes from refineries. The last thing you want to do is have a refinery go offline, and that will cause a key spike in gas, as an example, just before a long weekend. I know it goes up anyways before a long weekend, but imagine what would happen if the local refinery was offline. It then continues on, when it comes to the gas station model, to monitoring all the fuel at the gas station and other places. So as you can see, every step of the process uses IoT, and rightly so. When we come back from the break, we're going to cover how IoT is helping to improve the green energy or renewable energy space, as well as how it's helping electricity producers offer better service levels to their customers and their clients. Okay, welcome back. When you mention the word fossil fuels, as I did in the previous segment, you have to expect that a certain percentage of the population is going to have issues with it. So I did want to point out that I'm not in favor of more drilling, less drilling. That's really up to you to decide. I was just talking about IoT solutions and how they can make things more productive. The same goes, ironically, for green energy. I would have thought there wasn't as many people who were against green energy, but surprisingly, when I've done presentations in the past, I got almost as much, hate mail or issues with green energy as I did with fossil fuels. So again, like fossil fuels, I'm not here to debate the merits of either one of them. That's for you to decide. What I'm here to talk about is how IoT is helping to make green or renewable solutions much more productive. There are many different ways that energy is produced. I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The first has to do with solar, and that's solar panels and those kind of things. The second is wind, wind turbines. The third is what I call water produced, I'm not sure what the actual term is, and I'm not a scientist. I don't care. But that includes things like turbines that are turned by the flow of water. It also includes things about ocean current. And in my purpose, it also includes when they go down deep into the earth and they do things with thermal. That's all under what I call water produced. If you want to break them up into your areas, knock yourself out. The last area, again, I'm not getting into all the different nitty gritty, is what I call biodiesel. And that's when different plant-based organism is used to produce fuel. So again, if you want to delve down to the details, go ahead. In many parts of the world, solar power is providing energy to people, millions of people, where there is not an existing power grid. And that kind of makes sense. If you look at some rural areas of Africa or other parts of the world, there's no point in building some kind of a big generation system if there's no infrastructure to deliver the power to people's homes. And that's why solar is the optimal way to do local power production. And that obviously is for the third world, but also heavily used in first world countries as well. IoT helps before the installation even happens. Yes, there are some great historical data as to sunshine and how many hours a day it is, what the intensity is, but a lot of engineers like to use sensors before the installation has happened to get their own data. And they're now able to get data like they never would before. And even more so, the power of AI and big data helps engineers get the kind of accuracy that they can make the optimal choices. You have to remember too that this also changes based on the time of year. It's not only for northern climates where, the sun only comes up for a few hours a day. Even on some of the southern climates, if you happen to have different weather patterns where perhaps, the entire winter is cloud covered, this is where the sensors do a great job of picking that up. Once the panels are installed, it helps to monitor for production levels, and that's for a few reasons. The first is to make sure it's producing as expected. So if you were expecting so many kilowatts or megawatts, I'm not a nerd, I don't know those things, you want to know that you're getting what you thought you would. And if you're not getting that, you want the sensors to tell you perhaps what's happening. But it's also used for things like protection of the devices. Whether it's from vandalism, a lot of devices now are including even proximity sensors. That way you can know if an unwanted person is close to the panel, potentially going to damage it. But it's also for things like hail. And living in Alberta, hail is just part of life. We've had hailstorms that are so bad, it looks like I have 4 inches of snow on my front yard, but it's all hail. And in fact, it's gone through the siding of many homes. So I'm always suspect that these panels will hold up to hail. But from what we've seen so far, people that have them, it tends to do it pretty well. And in fact, they're making panels so rugged now that in many parts of the world, they're using space that you'd normally never think of for solar panels, and that's the road itself. They're starting to use these panels in place of asphalt. And the idea makes sense if these are spaces that people are on all the time, and obviously roads tend to be close to buildings. So the idea that you can use these roads and then have just a local little hookup for a building is great. And I think makes a lot of sense, assuming these panels can hold up to it. And time will tell, I guess. The other important part about monitoring is that many jurisdictions in North America, and I assume in other parts of the world too, allow homeowners who may generate an excessive amount of energy in the day. So take a summer day when the homeowner is at work and that sun is just cranking in on those solar panels. There's a good chance of generating more power than their home needs. So what the utilities smartly do is that they'll buy that power from the homeowner because during the daytime, especially in the summer, a lot of utilities are hitting peak demand. And then at night, when things cool down, the air conditioners aren't wailing away so much, what they'll do is they'll sell back electricity to the homeowner, often at a reduced rate. So this is great for the homeowner. They get their energy sold that they're not using, buy it back at a lower rate. So it probably makes a cheaper bill for them. But for the utility, it allows them to better handle peak demand and not have to go into things like brownouts. Similar to solar, engineers are using IoT solutions in the early planning stages of wind projects. And this could be for a single turbine, it could be for a wind farm. And they're using IoT to get much more accurate information about wind patterns and angles and all that kind of stuff. I know the information is probably somewhat available, but this allows them to do their own research because some of these projects are, millions or tens of millions of dollars. Once it's in place, though, it's important to know that the turbines are working as expected. So if you were expecting so much electricity to be produced and it's not, you're going to want to know why. And that's where IoT solutions allow the engineers to find out what's going on. They can see why they're not generating as much power. The other part is once the turbine is in, you can imagine that it's important to keep it moving. And this is where IoT solutions will monitor all the different components for things like heat, moisture, perhaps if they're drawing too much power, which could be a sign of a potential failure. And this helps to prevent unwanted downtime. In a similar kind of way, this is how IoT is helping some of the water-produced solutions. So when the water flow is coming by and turning the turbine, you're going to want to know the consistency of it. And you may even want to know things like pH level of the water, I'm not sure. Sensors are phenomenal for that, and that's very similarly used to what solar and wind do. The last area has to do with biodiesel. And the best way I can describe this is to tell a story about a fast food chain. And you might wonder, why exactly you're telling me a story about a fast food chain? There was a customer who owned a number of unhealthy businesses because they had a lot of fryers there. And obviously you have vegetable oil inside to do the frying. They used an IoT solution, but it was funny because there was 3 different companies that wanted the data from that. The first was obviously the owner of the restaurant. If those fryers are not working, he's pretty much out of business. So he's going to want to know they're not working and be alarmed. But the manufacturer of the fryers and or the servicer, I'm not quite sure which one it was, is also going to want to know they're not working so they can dispatch somebody out there, but also so they can get information about how their machines are used to be able to make them better in the future. Funny though, the third one you may not think of, and that's the person who owns the oil. You see, the owner of the restaurant has sold that oil to a company that you will use it for biodiesel afterwards. So they're going to want to keep track of things like particles or any unwanted things that could be inside the oil. They're going to want to know its viscosity or whatever they use to determine when it's time to take it. So it's important for them to know this. So the same IoT solution was used for 3 customers, which I always thought was a great example. So the last big area is about electricity. And let's face it, we're an iPhone and Android world. I can't see many of us living too long without electricity anymore. I get it, there's batteries on these things, but at some point, your 13-year-old is going to blow through the battery and you're going to need to get it charged. So our society has moved an awful lot from electricity being a nice to have to it has to be up and running at all times. And that's only for the consumer, it's the same for the businesses as well. This makes it harder on utility companies because they're being pressed to deliver more reliable service than ever before, but to do so with a minimal effect on the environment. And a lot of things that we're talking about now using are going to make it even harder on them. I asked a utility executive one time, what keeps you up at night? And he said the idea of our 1 million customers all coming in to their homes at 5 o'clock after a day of work and plugging in their smart cars or their electric cars just scares the heck out of them. So they need to use IoT solutions to help. And they're doing it in a number of ways. I'm going to break it down to 2 areas just to simplify it. One is how power is delivered into your general area. And then the second one is how energy is delivered into your home specifically. So again, I'm not a nerd here. So please, anybody in the utility space, don't slam me for not knowing the names of the different products. But utilities use very specific equipment at the transmission sites. You can imagine the amount of EMI and things in the area. I think the average Cisco router would just explode. So they use very specific equipment. And they also use a lot of IoT equipment to be able to monitor just about every aspect of a transmission station. Are the lines coming in? Are they producing as much as expected? Are there any issues? What the wind might be in the area? What the ambient temperature might be? Buildup of ice? They want to know everything. And so they're heavy users of different sensor-based technology. What's funny is that a lot of people who were living in the eastern part of the US and Canada in 2003 kind of wish they had those products before. Because in 2003, we had one of the biggest outages in history. The good thing is that every year, the lines get smarter and everything gets smarter. So the chances of that happening are diminishing every year. And that's mostly thanks to IoT. Once the power gets into your neighborhood, IoT helps to optimize power usage and service at your home, as well as to streamline operations for the utilities. If you ask most people, the term smart meter has a very negative tone, because in some cases it's led to higher rates per kilowatt hour. But I think people have to realize what is done as well. It helps to reduce the billing clerical efforts. It helps to catch things like grow-ops and people that are stealing power. So I think if people really understood what smart meters do and how they benefit everyone, I'm not sure they would have as much of an issue. Finally, as I mentioned, there's an issue with potentially smart cars or electric cars or whatever ones you plug into the wall. IoT is helping here. Some utilities are mandating that these charging stations have the intelligence to work with them. So imagine you come home and you're not using your car again until the next morning, and you might require 4 hours charging. Your instinct is just to plug the car in, and it does its 4 hours charging, and then it does its thing and shuts itself off afterwards. Well, the utility might not want that. They might want to say, any chance you could be charged from 2 to 6 in the morning, and we'll give you a lower rate to do so. And this is where there's a sync up between the utilities and these chargers taking place. So, great area. One great thing about IoT is it tends to have a lot of benefits that help everybody. And regardless of which of these 4 main areas you're in, it helps people produce energy more effectively, but it also helps to reduce greenhouse gases, to make workplaces safer, and to make the overall systems more reliable. And that allows us to get the energy we need for our iPhones and for our car. Well, thanks again for listening to this podcast. I do appreciate any feedback, so reach out to me through LinkedIn if we're connected. You can do it through our Facebook page, The Internet of Things Made Simple, or you can drop me a line if we're personally connected. And for those who are new to the show, we have some great material in our back catalog. A few of them I wanted to highlight is that we have things like the 9 reasons why all small businesses truly need to use IoT, what you need to know about 5G, and the one that's gotten some controversy, why buying a 5G phone this year is a bad idea. I definitely recommend you listen to those. Thanks again. I'm Larry Bohumor. Take care.